It's been a long time coming to Rome, hasn't it? Just to mention on last week's passage, chapter 27, Peter Isaac sent me a very interesting documentary on YouTube about the beach where the shipwreck is believed to have happened, and the lead remains of 4 Roman anchors discovered by scuba divers in the 70s at a depth of about 90 foot, exactly what Luke says in what he records in chapter 27. I'll put the link to it in Dear Grace Church tomorrow if you happen to be interested. Well, we rejoined Paul and his shipmates here on a beach in Malta in late October, early November morning. They were all soaking wet and exhausted from the swim, which would have been just over a mile from the sandbank. They'd been up all night. It was raining. They'd endured a fortnight-long storm with all kinds of the terrors and the seasickness that must have gone along with that. And there were storm-force winds still. So hypothermia would have been inevitable if it wasn't for the kindness of the Maltese, taking time out of their mornings, being late to milk the cows or whatever else they'd intended to do that morning. But they could help these stricken strangers who had no means to repay them. For many chapters in the book of Acts, it's looked like Paul has just been a pawn in the Roman justice system, literally tossed by the seas. And before that, just messed about by various Roman governors and others. It's looked like actually God isn't powerful enough to look after him. He's not able to go on his journey to Rome to preach the gospel there as he'd intended. But in this chapter, we see that actually that's not the case. Here we see that Jesus is serving a greater king than Caesar. Caesar kind of looms over all these chapters. He's the final destination for Paul's legal disputes. One day he will stand before Nero and plead his case, and his authority and the fear of him kind of overshadows a few chapters here. But this section just points out Paul is serving a much greater king. Have a look at verse 2. The islanders showed us unusual kindness. They built a fire and welcomed us all because it was raining and cold. Now, until this time, I reading it, I'd always imagined that this was a bonfire on a beach. But of course, it's raining, so that wouldn't be a sensible place to build a fire or to try and warm up. The word translated welcomed means not just to say, hello, it's nice to see you, but to welcome inside. And they welcomed them all, which is quite an undertaking when consider that there were 276 of them. Whether they were all welcomed into one huge barn or split between loads of different homes, I don't know. But all this kindness came to them through thoroughly pagan people, expressing God's common grace for those in need. While in Ephesus, in Acts chapter 19, verse 21, Paul had decided to go to Jerusalem, passing through Macedonia and Achaia. After I've been there, he said, I must visit Rome also. Now, since that time, he's survived at least 3 assassination plots. He's been beaten up twice. He's had to make 5 legal defenses to false capital charges. He's been imprisoned by a corrupt governor. He's been sold out by Felix and then Festus for political reasons. He's been shipwrecked, and now he's poisoned by a snake bite. Now, we might have been tempted to take him to one side and tell him, look, mate, I don't think God's blessing this. Maybe, you think this is your path, but I don't think God's on your side in this. Maybe he's not even paying attention. I think maybe you should just take the hints that the door's not open for you to go to Rome and do something else. God had promised him in chapter 23, verse 11, take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. It's like all the forces of evil are conspiring to keep him back. But God is the one who engineers all things for the good of those who love him. If he'd not been arrested, maybe Paul's prison letters, Colossians, Ephesians, Philemon, and Philippians, would never have been written. If it had not been for Felix's corruption, hoping for a bribe, so keeping Paul in prison for so long, maybe Luke's Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles would never have been written. Luke almost certainly researched, interviewed, and the eyewitnesses and wrote those two books while he was waiting for Paul to be released. If he'd not been falsely accused, Paul wouldn't have had the chance to preach to all the rulers in the Judean region. If Festus had been braver and more just, Paul wouldn't have appealed to Caesar and be on his way to preach before the Emperor Nero himself and his courts. Interestingly, when you get to the letter to the Philippians, he mentions that there are believing members of Caesar's household, whether those are family members or members of the bodyguard. We can't be sure, but clearly his time there in the palace was fruitful. If it hadn't have been for the storm, the gospel may not have reached Malta for generations. Paul's ship had no plans to go to Malta. They were going to go way up to the north. They were clearly planning on staying quite close to the coast. The storm blew them to the south of Crete and then blew them out of control down to the south and then to the west. King Jesus uses all things to build his kingdom through the hospitality of believers in verses 14 and through pagans in verses 2 and 7. Through loyal doctors and friends like Luke, and through corrupt officials like Felix, through favourable winds on a pagan ship in verse 13, and a ruinous typhoon in the last chapter, through wise kings like Plutus, and tyrants like Felix and Nero, through good health, and verse 3, Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and as he put it on the fire, a viper driven out by the heat fastened itself on his hand. Now, I love Paul's servant heart. You know, you think if you've been in a storm for a fortnight, you've swum a mile, you're cold and wet and exhausted, you'd understand him just saying, you know, I just need to curl up in a ball for a minute and can somebody else take care of the fire? But you know, he's a good example for us, isn't he? He's working hard, doing what he can to help out. He is a servant by heart, like his master, the Lord Jesus. But then verse 4, he's bitten by this snake. When the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to each other, "This man must be a murderer, for though he escaped from the sea, the goddess Justice has not allowed him to live." Now, there are no poisonous snakes on Malta these days, but we know in other parts of the Mediterranean there are. There was a British tourist in 2016 who was bitten on their hotel veranda in Turkey and died of the snake bite. So we know that they live around the Mediterranean, and at one point it seems they were there on Malta as well. Certainly, all of the residents of all the people that saw it, who were from Malta, saw the snake and were convinced that if he's bitten by that, he's not going to survive. See, they thought the gods must be determined to rid the earth of Paul. The god of the sea had just taken his best shot. There were bits of boat floating all over the place, but the goddess Justice just won't let him escape. She's not content to smash his boat up and destroy the journey. No, he's made it onto the dry land, and she's going to make sure he can be finished off. Well, we know that God isn't like that, is he? You see, all of Paul's sufferings don't prove that God is against him. No, actually, Paul teaches that actually it's through sufferings we go to glory. It's as we follow the Lord Jesus, picking up our cross and following him, that we go against the grain of so much of what the world, our flesh, and the devil want for us, and we push on through, following the Lord Jesus, who has rescued us and is taking us home. And if it hadn't been for this snake bite, who knows what other opportunities would have been lost. See what happens next in verse 5. But Paul shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. The people expected him to swell up or suddenly fall dead. But after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. So they swing from one error to the opposite extreme. But here is God using all kinds of factors for the good of those that love him, to build up his kingdom. And there may be all kinds of things that happen to you in this life that you think, it just seems so random and pointless and horrible. Well, actually, some people describe this life as like looking at somebody who's weaving a carpet or doing some cross stitch, and we're looking at the back. There are all these messy threads hanging all over the place. It just seems chaotic, but you flip it over, you see it from the other sides, you see it from heaven, and it's beautiful. You see what God was doing all along. It all makes sense, and it's all set out there. It's all absolutely perfect. Well, God in his sovereign power uses all things together for the good of his people, to build up his kingdom. And next we see Paul serves a greater king whose power is limitless. Have a look at verse 7, because here, as we've seen, Paul has looked weak for a long time now, thrown about by the Roman justice system and oppressed by various evil men. And it's still the case today in many parts of the world. Tom was praying for persecuted believers in Nigeria. Pastor Wang Yi, I'd urge you to keep praying for him. He's pastor of the Early Rain Covenant Church in China, and has been in prison for the last 18 months. His church members were asked to sign a letter declaring that they no longer believed in Jesus, and without signing that, they're excluded from government jobs, and most of the professional jobs available in China are tied up with the Communist Party, and so massive implications for their career, their standard of living, and all of that sort of thing. Just incredibly cruel, even though Pastor Wang Yi preaches submission to authorities in all things right and good, and encourages people to be wonderful, good members of society. It's their horror at what it says about justice and human rights, that it encourages them the Communist Party to clamp down like this. Richard Wurmbrandt was a pastor in Poland during the Cold War, and he was arrested for preaching the gospel, and for 14 years held in prison. He was tortured several times. They tried to send him insane, because when he was in the prisons, he would preach the gospel to fellow prisoners and lead other prisoners and guards to the Lord Jesus. And so they put him in solitary confinement. It was a cell deep underground, where the lights were never turned on, and there was absolute silence. Even the guards were made to wear boots with felt linings underneath, so that even their footsteps didn't make any sound, just to try and send him insane through this complete isolation. They had people visit his wife, pretending to be prisoners released from jail, saying that they'd been to Richard's funeral, that she should grieve and move on and even remarry. They expelled his son from his education because of his dad being a political prisoner. They told him in prison, "You're the only one left. None of your church, nobody else in Poland, Romania, not Poland. No one else in Romania is still worshipping the Lord Jesus, and in the West as well, they've gone away from Jesus. You're the only one. You're crazy." Well, eventually he was ransomed and greatly used as he traveled around telling people his story of how the Lord was with him in that prison cell, how meditating on the scriptures kept him sane, what he'd memorized. He settled in the US and he lived to see the whole structure of Romanian and Soviet communism come crashing down in answer to God's people's prayers. Have a look at verses 7 to 9. There was an estate near that belonging to Publius, the chief official of the islands. He welcomed us to his home and showed us generous hospitality for 3 days. His father was ill in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went in to see him and after prayer placed his hands on him and healed him. Here's this weak man off the beach. He hears that Publius's dad is ill, lays his hands on him, and Jesus decides he's going to heal him. Heals him instantly. And verse 9, when this had happened, the rest of those on the island who were ill came and were cured. They honored us many days, and when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with the supplies we needed. Here's a display of God's saving power. This is reminiscent of Paul in Ephesians, in Ephesus, isn't it? Where all kinds of people brought their sick and demon-possessed were healed. No one is sent away disappointed. There's this power of God present to save. We're used to hearing about missionaries who are sent from the West, sent maybe with medical qualifications and resources to set up mission hospitals, and or with the resources to set up schools, and sharing the gospel from a position of strength. And yet here we see Paul, like Jesus after him. I'm not in any way criticizing those works. I think that that sort of work has done more than almost anything else to bless the developing world over the last 200 years. But here, Paul looks very much like the Lord Jesus, doesn't he? He comes to save in weakness, empty-handed. He has nothing apart from the Lord that he proclaims. And we discover that actually that's more than enough. Or all these people coming to him and being healed, a display of God's enormous power. Now, it doesn't mention preaching in Acts here on Malta. It seems a bit strange, doesn't it? It's the normal pattern, but look at the way they send them off. Look at the fact that Paul spent 3 months there. I'm sure it would have been a little bit different here. The word for islanders is actually the word barbarians. That doesn't mean that the islanders were savage, as you can see from the passage, but it means that they didn't speak Greek or Latin, and so if you were hearing them speak, the Romans very rudely called other people barbarians. It meant when they spoke, it just sounded like they were barring like sheep, bar 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 bar. So they called them barbarians. So preaching would have been different. It would have been difficult, but clearly Publius could make himself understood to Paul. And if you've been reading the rest of Acts, you know what he did. He shared the gospel with them. These miracles were not there just to say thanks for the grub. They were to demonstrate the authority and the authenticity of God's messenger to them. God loved Malta. I don't know how important Malta was to everyone else, but to God they were precious. God had sovereignly decided that Paul was going to be washed up on that beach, and that he would share the gospel with the rest of them. Church history records that Publius went on to ended up being the pastor of the churches on Malta for over 30 years after this, until he was recalled to be a governor in Athens and was executed under the emperor Hadrian in the beginning of the 2nd century. But the church in Malta carried on for centuries, and there's records of representatives going to the various church councils like Chalcedon and others. Far from Paul just being a pawn thrown all over the place by the Roman system. Actually, he was proclaiming a God who is on a higher throne. He was vindicated by a higher judge, and he was proclaiming something so much better than just liberation from prison. Here was an opportunity for small and great alike to come and be adopted by the Lord Jesus, the King of all nations. No matter what was thrown at Paul, because of the promise God made, he was brought safely to Rome.